Recently, a minister contacted me via Twitter. This minister was super friendly and approachable. I called the minister's electorate and reported that the minister had obviously been hacked due to suspicious activity observed. I mean, when does a minister ever listen and engage and try to be helpful? Much of our modern civilization is based on the belief that we have achieved such progress through some rite of passage by enduring and winning some kind of survival of the fittest battle. Be that the strongest, the smartest, or the most advanced, we believe ourselves to be the subjects of the fittest legacy, the winners. Even with the search for racial equality, it is still deemed that we are here because we are the best of our kind. That belief system in our capitalist world means that the ones who contribute the most financially are the fittest. Thus, those who don't or can't work, those that rely on social care or are too old or too young, are not the fittest. Those people are allowed to survive because of the deeds of others. The poorer countries, the starving, the war-torn, and forevermore the disabled. This ingrained theory throughout history has justified and contributed to racism, to poverty and wars and elitism. The gods are stronger, more beautiful, smarter, all-knowing, even if they are now black, Asian or gender diverse, but they are rarely disabled. Unless it's in an acceptable way, heroes can be deaf or blind as long as they are drop-dead gorgeous. We worship and thank qualities that for most part is quite unobtainable, even with modern Instagram filters. For most of us, the homeless, the poor, the sick and the disabled, the third world countries are all somehow less than and deserving of less, hereby virtue of our good grace, charity. It is still a commonly held belief that those who are less fortunate, who are homeless, deserve it, or are there because of some defect. Perhaps they are alcoholics or drug abusers or criminals. It's never because our capitalist system is an unfair, brutal, random dictator of who ends up in the rubbish bin. Of course, if you can't even get to the table as a stakeholder to play the odds, will never be in your favour. So even though we aspire to great social changes, the bare bones framework underneath remains the same. People were called handicapped because they went cap in hand to beg. Because their survival, despite human rights, as long as survival depends on money, relies on the good grace of others. As long as everyone does have a place at the table as stakeholders, the phrase beggars can't be choosers will remain the law behind all else, even if we do let them eat cake. The man who was attributed as first coining the phrase survival of the fittest was Charles Darwin. Ask yourself then, what is the effect on humanity, on our future direction as a species and a society if he didn't say anything about survival of the fittest? Because he didn't. He said that it would be the kindest who would most prosper. On reflection of our history, it is indeed kindness, community, compassion, and cooperation that countless times saved us. What if the jungle out there, as we have called it, isn't as we have believed? What if an ant working together as a community could take down a lion? What if our values are all wrong and it is essential to our survival that we leave no one behind or our civilization fails? What if we are measuring it all wrong? Success, contribution and worth. Especially as now our success means we live longer and often despite whatever our disability is. Can you honestly, hand on heart, challenge your own stereotypes? Because if we can't, we are no better than any other regime who believed in eugenics. In our modern world, that is exactly the direction we are going. Unless we measure our KPIs, our performance indicators with something else and dematerialise the GDP. When asked what is a life worth, there will always be a monetary answer. As saving money in the budget equates to less of those lives, yet as far back as 500,000 years ago, skeletons have been found that were disabled, that lived to a good age, and were obviously cared for in their community and regarded well. Why does our modern advanced society in the 500,000 years since not do better than our supposed animal-like brutish ancestors so long ago? We are not as advanced as we think we are. The most significant act of social reform in modern history in Australia occurred after the Second World War. In fact, it occurred all over the world: welfare for the poor, for single mothers and the disabled. Then came deinstitutionalisation, and then the NDIS. The NDIS, as an act of government social reform, was designed to implement social change from the inside out, or the top down. It was created in a response to a productivity report, which had been long fought for by the disability community, that people with a disability can live in the community and live full lives, that society needed to adapt to allow for all peoples. Sounds simple enough, but in fact it was huge change. It isn't just a case of not placing people in institutions and shoving them in houses in the community. It was about society changing its values. That particular institution has invisible walls and is proving a much bigger barrier. We can plonk people in the community, but living their best lives is easier said than done. Since the implementation of the NDIS has failed to become the great social reform it was heralded to be. For some, it has changed lives, but it has caused significant trauma and suffering to both participant and provider. It has been a source of phenomenal fraud and mobilisation of significant gang networks in human trafficking, exploitation of labour, blatant fraud and cruelty. The behemoth of the NDIS sprung up like a sea monkey to grow independently of all else in a vacuum of bureaucracy and secrecy, and attacked those it was intended to serve. Many disabled people had not been a part of society and had not grown up in schools, workplaces and the common social system. They grew up in vacuums. The institutions were never just the buildings, they were the beliefs and the society that built them. Systemically institutionalised people struggled with realities of working and employing staff, or running plans in some cases that were several $100,000 up to $1 million per annum as self-managed. Take anyone long-term unemployed or institutionalised in any way and provoke such a large change, and it will be a challenge. Many with disabilities wishing for inclusion, as well as many without, have no idea how that will look. Are there special allowances like behaviour or physical or cognitive? Are we even allowed to ask those questions? How is it then possible for those people to manage, say, a $500,000 plan? The staff for that, the consumer bargaining and gaining services and payment. Okay, so self-managed was meant to be only for those most capable. Well, it didn't always go down that way, especially considering you needed a PhD to be able to navigate the NDIS system. And it became a full-time job. Society wasn't ready for it either. Hospitals that have poor wet area access, or too small lifts for power chairs, or no lifts for x-ray or scans, medical specialists that don't provide for disabilities. I have an optometrist ask me, why give him glasses? He probably can't read. Hospital registers say surely they would have no quality of life. How about we just, let them go? This is beyond public transport and air travel and a few ramps here and there. Also, most kids never see a person in a wheelchair. Workplaces that don't even consider hiring a person with a disability. The legion of services and complementary companies required to make the NDIS ideals just didn't initially exist. We just slapped on an ideal as a band-aid in a place of the catastrophic and decades of incompetence, fraud and neglect that had gone before. And a lot of those companies who had grown up quite big and fat from disability services were never challenged or punished. They were heralded at the top of the game, powerful institutions, but the NDIS made way for some new ones. No preparation was even considered with the implementation of the NDIS. So yeah, it became an oasis. You try going to a minister about a complaint. No, everything goes to the NDIS, that's federal. How discriminatory and ableist can you get? Seriously, I mean it. It is the height of ignorance. Do I, for everything in my life, have to go to a women's minister? I have a problem at school, go to the women's minister. I have a problem at work, go to the women's minister. Have a problem in a hospital. Oh, go to the women's minister. Legal problem. And so on. Until we break down the walls of the invisible institution in society, the NDIS is not likely to succeed. And disabled cannot be a part of society or a community. For many reasons. But because each little home has to then become an institution, and in and of itself it means heavier reliance on supports. I don't believe people were fairly set up for success. I also don't believe that there needs to be any other method than plan managed. There still can be huge influence and total control from the participant. There must be. There can be self-managed, just paid through a plan manager. We didn't need to paint a target on vulnerable people's heads. We also didn't need to unfairly place people in situations that were not best placed for best success. Despite the portal being rather dinky and easy to commit fraud with no checks in place to cross-check, instead of making it further complicated, why not just use plan managers? They are independent from government also, and everyone else. It doesn't mean by any means that participants or their nominees or their advocates or guardians can't still manage their plan. And they should. No other area of society places such onus on an individual, which to me looked like look, we're giving you control. Were you? The NDIS was implemented before society was ready and before providers were ready. You can't just decide to push change and not bring others with you. Training and education of all of the other services, training of staff, plus accommodation availability to accommodate it, plus studies performed to work out if care in the community is tenable. If there are no providers, then, well, regardless of anything else, there will be no care in the community. I have to say that, as it stands directly. Direct supports are not financially tenable, necessarily. So the NDIS was at odds with the rest of government, providers and participants, and society. It was a huge load on many participants who found it stressful enough. New roles were created almost every 5 minutes, with no understanding who would do them, how they would do them, what the role was, what qualifications. Support coordination is a fine example of that. The sudden lunge with utopian vigour placed people alone in the community, facing systemic advocacy issues as individuals. The majority of advocacy agencies are systemic advocates and not available for personal advocacy. The role hadn't really existed and had never been more needed, so the rest of government deferred everything to NDIS, despite the fact that 90% of people who with a disability aren't on it. For those coming onto the NDIS with no funding, yet for support coordinator, it meant pro bono, for a support coordinator who would often advocate for them. So many in the community found themselves unable to integrate into a community that just wasn't ready for people with disabilities. Yes, I know, there is a Disability Discrimination Act. It is about as useful as safeguards is when regulating an unregistered provider. In reality, hospitals barely have accessibility, and their staff have no idea what the NDIS is. Theatres, workplaces, and even schools are way beyond the 8 ball, so it was a case of go live in a house in a community, but the community isn't ready for you. We don't even have universal design as a part of our building code. So everything from the NDIS to the local supermarket became a fight. Those who rent privately can't have necessarily modifications required to live. Community is not disability friendly, and though we have an NDIS, neither is the rest of government. It is monumentally infuriating going to a minister and being told, oh, that's a federal matter, which is a nice way of saying, well, we haven't got a clue, but the NDIS do all that disability stuff. Considering the Disability Discrimination Act was 40 years ago, and we now have had disabled living in the community for that time, it is an outrageous failure that government didn't have disability policies across all of its services. I have advocated for several people over the years, and it is generally at my own cost, either getting a plan review or getting a plan first time or accommodation or services, or crisis care. There's generally a gap in funding that leaves the person high and dry. So funding for personal advocacy services and NDIS trained advisors would go a long way to supporting people. And having advocates that know enough to be able to support them is very hard to find. Because people, believe me, there is nowhere else to go for these people. There is a huge adversarial situation between support workers and participants, even to a degree between carers and participants. This is resulting in a devaluing of the role. The role has changed significantly in the community. It relies on someone who is competent enough to manage often complex situations without supervision, either behaviourally complex or medically complex. The current best case scenario of training is not fit for purpose. Employers exploit staff and employ them casually at sporadic hours without support or supervision or backup. They struggle as a general rule to gain 20 hours of work a week, so employers can take advantage of work grants and employ as many at 20 hours as possible. They gain $6,000 a person, they farm the grants. It is often a dangerous situation to work with no care plan, high-risk care and hostility. Few are flooding towards this role because they are treated so poorly. They are in the middle and often hated and resented by both the participant and the provider. The situation is different across all of the states. Unregistered providers in Victoria can mean someone who was qualified but an unregistered company. The expense of registration is such that if places unregistered at a market advantage, they also have far less risk because safeguards can only hold them to the code of conduct, and yet we're unsure whether insurance will actually cover an unregistered provider. So it is fair to say the NDIS is actively bastardising its own marketplace and encouraging the less risk unregistered providers. The code of conduct is in fact being used as a shield to justify why nothing can be done about unregistered providers. I cannot imagine their frustration. Can you imagine mine? How about being told that those with home detention tag support workers have a right to work in the community when employed by an unregistered provider, as long as they are loosely kind of following the code of conduct? I cannot imagine the code of conduct was written for that purpose, as a benchmark on neglect and abuse. I could see the advantage of a boutique support worker who was qualified being able to give high attention to someone. In Victoria, this is a different case in South Australia. In Victoria, there is a disability commissioner. That commission registers support workers and has a minimum standard of qualification. So registered or unregistered provider, you get a qualified support worker with minimum qualifications. It is the same in Queensland with the blue card system. Sure, we still need to lift that standard, but at least there is one. However, in my state, an unregistered provider can employ someone who doesn't even have a first aid certificate against someone with years of experience and multiple certificates and security clearances. Sure, a good attitude is really important, but sometimes, depending on the disability, we need them to know their stuff. It is very variable across the country. However, I believe that providers who provide care to more than one person should be registered, as they should be to perform certain tasks. That registration could be a lot easier to obtain and a lot more comprehensive and supportive of providers. At the moment, it's a lot of mucking around and money, but not necessarily with an outcome that equates to quality. Perhaps provider training that provides all the systems and policies and has an accreditation would be a better place to start for many. For South Australia, I have tried 2 lots of government, now 6 different ministers, and the answer about support workers is always, that's a federal matter. I wholeheartedly disagree and think that's a cop-out. I do believe that all support workers should be regulated and registered nationally, that they should have minimum qualifications and be regulated by a state disability commissioner who is then managed by a federal commissioner. This enables people to have some bridging between state and federal services. For the NDIS, it also allows for safeguarding of the other 90% who aren't on the NDIS. A commissioner would also be able to oversee some of the catch-up required for services and infrastructure to be disability friendly across the greater community. We also need to remove some of the confusion and hocus pocus with regards to gaining NDIS funding and at plan time. Though it is not a medical model, the fact that disability is often proven by medical professionals does seem to overburden OTs to speak out of scope. Plans from pre-NDIS were about for the report for an OT were about $400, and now they're about $3,000 and more. It doesn't necessarily give an accurate picture as an OT. Is, well, an OT and not a specialist medical professional. They are allied health. Despite creating huge demand for OTs, it has left people in the NDIS somewhat confused. Reports from whoever they can get are sent in, and there is no clarity as to what will come forward. Now, of course, the NDIS can use artificial intelligence model, and in time and age and disability will have a fairly accurate idea of what the funding will be. But we have to build the data first. I think it would be wise if GPs were able to charge for formulating the reports. They should have adequate data to provide a good picture. Not saying we won't need OTs, but using them at large instead of medical is becoming a bit farcical. Maybe after an initial assessment, a new participant could be granted a pre-admission fund from Centrelink in order to fund reports and assessments. The NDIS has provoked the creation of many new roles: support coordinators, personal advocates, recovery coaches, psychosocial coaches. There has been a great deal of confusion, with LACs and NDIS planners and plan managers and support coordinators and case managers as to exactly who does what. Definition of roles and role boundaries prevent overlap and allow for greater competency in the roles we undertake and ensure that we stay within our scope of practice. As a support coordinator, I also do quality control. I will cite people and make sure their environment is okay. I'll check in and make sure things are going to plan. I will liaise between providers. I am available to discuss the plan and future plans facing the NDIS also. Self-checking and quality control are very important, as it seems people are unaware of what their roles are and who does what. There is a distinct lack of cohesion. The Honourable Bill Shorten spoke of the NDIS being the oasis in the desert, and I totally agree. The haste with which states seem to palm off anything disability is discouraging. Inclusion isn't only about disability. It is about a great many things, and with a significant ageing population, access issues and the need to understand physical needs and access applies to a large portion of the population. Housing that is not access friendly means elderly with all the money in the world won't be able to age at home. Private housing that doesn't account for access needs means the greater portion of help must and can only come from government. SDA housing will only account for a very small percentage of those with disabilities. It's not the answer, and frequently goes to intellectually disabled in favour of physical. High needs are robust because it's easier to organise the care. SDA in communities has had little planning thought. With 3 or 4 people living in a home together, they each may have 1 or 2 support workers, not to mention visitors, and there is in the main no provision for the extra cars in a neighbourhood street, which would be like 6 to 8 cars per household. Participants aren't given their own social areas for privacy to socialise and choice of who they live with, and often get caught with the support workers already attending the house, so the choice is hugely compromised just to be technically placed in the community. Transport and location to public transport, if it even accommodates disabled, is often not readily available, as is provision for pets, family members or friends to stay with you and visit. Waste management is a contentious issue. Ask neighbours next to many SDA and they'll tell you they are fed up with dirty sanitary items in their bins. But whilst fund managers reap 30% and many high-profile names sit on boards and shamoozle the people who can open doors for them, little attentions are being placed upon other housing solutions. However, given the calamity crisis level care we are in, it is time to look at other options. Due to the lack of skills in support workers and the will to pay as little as possible for the grants, there is a tendency to cherry pick the best or easiest clients. Those that are deemed difficult or too high needs or high risk are often found to have poorer care. They end up with the least experienced providers who are unable to choose and aren't experienced enough to know what they're in for. They just see the money. In a capitalist system, being able to choose means some people go from provider to provider before finding themselves with no care and placed in a hospital system. These untouchable clients are often highest needs, and many have mental health issues that require expertise beyond a simple first aid certificate. This is very much a huge part of the case with Anne-Marie, who died in Adelaide. Knowing to be difficult, these people become notorious in the sector, and they end up in inappropriate care where they can't be managed safely. To deinstitutionalise is one thing, but to do so at the disadvantage of people is another. To ignore that there are skills required, not only disenfranchise an entire workforce, but also places participants with higher needs at risk. These are the ones most at risk. To dissolve the institutions and all of that expertise and resources means we have no crisis care. We have nowhere other than hospital for many to go or nursing homes. Then there are boarding houses and specialist residential facilities, which are nothing more than institutions. Then there are the prisons, whose disabled population is around 66%. On the surface, it may look like we are deinstitutionalising, when in reality, we are shoving people anywhere we can find, like a 10-year-old with a plate of broccoli. Hospitals, nursing homes, prison, boarding houses, and residential services and group homes, which are resource poor and choice redundant, or they end up poorly cared for in isolation in a home with inadequate services, just like Anne-Marie. We haven't even identified who these most at-risk people are. In South Australia, we shoved them in Hampstead, and then there were over 400 complaints. When the beds filled up and again in the hospitals, they shoved them in the repat, and now they've opened a 25-bed facility to shove them there. The ignorance and lack of knowledge in disability services and healthcare is dazzling. Incompetence and competence in the wrong places are the single biggest risk to safeguards. There was no clear plan on how we were not only going to deinstitutionalise but integrate disabled people into society, to train, prepare and develop a plan for mentally ill beyond the criminal justice system, to build communities for people beyond feathering fund managers' nests. Our emergency rooms are filled with mental health cases every night of the week. But they are living in the community, right? There exists that fine line between social care modelling and putting people at risk. This is a balance that we must find without losing momentum or changing course in contemporary care and enabling people to be free of the burdens of day-to-day care and to live their best lives. There is a significant housing shortage, especially for low-income and vulnerable people. Even with the record spending this new Labor government has committed to, it will only meet 3% of the housing needs. In addition to a considerable skills shortage in a marketplace no one wants to work in anymore, with a funding system that has no idea how it comes up with the figures, and a health system that is in serious crisis. Often, important information isn't passed on between doctors, specialists and participants and providers. When a participant is handballed between every provider in town, it isn't shared with the next provider. This potentially places participants at risk and support workers. If the NDIS are aware of certain issues, then I think they have an obligation to disclose if it benefits the health and welfare of the participant or the potential health and safety of staff. Instead, nothing gets handed over, and the poor participant is destined to repeat the whole process again and again. If sharing occurred, it may be of huge benefit to the participant to receive the proper care. And it places support workers at huge risk. There is huge exploitation and abuse occurring in this work sector. They are poorly regarded by PWD, they are churned like fodder by their employers, and they are often physically, mentally, sexually abused by their participants. Nothing gets reported. Again, it's like registered and unregistered providers. Those who are very professional, highly qualified, feel very let down being hired alongside people who don't even speak English, have no qualifications and are just shift fillers. What does that tell you about your own worth? The fundamental difference between government-provided services and private services in a capitalist community is the insurance. This system is yet to be tested sufficiently by private benchmarks of care, which are often insurance. If it wasn't right, they don't pay. Insurance companies don't matter. In government, there is an endless pot and things can be absorbed. However, in private industry, it can bring an industry to a grinding halt. I predict current course, this is a possibility. Then industry will dictate to government, much like the aged care sector. Our healthcare system is also disjointed in that we have a hospital system and not a healthcare system. Even between different hospitals, it's like going to a different country sometimes. Their ability to look after disabled clients is appalling, and their deployment of medical model of care is criminal and archaic. The worst case scenario is if they think you are a casual employee from their bank staff to come to sit with the crib, because then you are open to how their workforce functions, with bullying at its core. The withdrawal of the participants' medications at admission, I have watched it myself. It's caused serious repercussions, if not death. Finding staff within a hospital that are familiar with participants with disability is very rare. There is very little communication between the hospital and the providers and the GP. They aren't very keen to have carers come in either. Just recently I sat with a participant. I flew to another state to attend to in time to place him in hospital. 29 hours later, he died, still in emergency. He was difficult for some to handle, but there is no caveat for duty of care. I'm certain that most of us have heard many of these things before, perhaps on more than one occasion. In the past years since the NDIS came to life, I think at this point it gives us a unique opportunity to stop and look and adjust. There are many things that we can do to make the system work better. Yet the question here is, what can we do to instill trust now, to change the current culture of the NDIS and around the NDIS and amongst the disability community towards it? It's also important that the taxpayers at large are seeing a system that works for the people, because that drives the political parties. I'd like to think that most aren't interested in figures if the overarching speech is positive, but if it's expensive and it's failing, then it becomes a significant issue. I think, in conclusion, we need to make sure that society, being the people, the infrastructure and other government departments, are aware of the social change the NDIS is designed to be. We need to educate about disability and the social contemporary model of care. Government departments across the board, and especially at state level, need to also embrace this initiative, as do the people in the community. We need to regulate and register support workers with minimum qualifications across the board to lift the quality of care and profile of this role. Culturally, it will take time, but we need to build bridges between participants and their staff. This adversarial relationship that is far too prevalent needs to change. It can start to change with respecting the role, but also if the role is treating the participant with respect and consistent quality of care in standards that are delivered. I've had rewarding relationships when this is done well, and I've seen staff stay with a person for 20 to 30 years. We need to encourage that and put compassion back into care. There needs to be a definitive standard for parameters that funding is given, something that is not so random, not based on who had the biggest lawyer or loudest mum or support worker, or who camped outside the office or knew someone. It currently just isn't fair. I don't want to feel like there is a large chocolate wheel at the NDIS office that is spun to determine funding. The roles need defining and a clear customer pathway needs to be evolved. It is so haphazard at the moment. No one knows who does what they should be doing and whose job it is. Have processes in safeguarding where if you report something actually happens. If I hear one more time, "Oh, they aren't registered, it doesn't matter, they killed them, they didn't breach the code," I will scream. We need to be clear on safeguarding and not allow it to be utilised as a bitch fest for competitors to bother each other. The state-based commissioner system and uniformity across the board will help. Safeguards need to evolve into that commissioner system and be supported in their role. Then, when it's a government department that commits a safeguarding breach, the safeguards can do something about that too, like employment agencies or schools or hospitals. Lastly, it is really hard to deal with government as a provider or an entrepreneur. Recently, a minister contacted me via Twitter This minister was super friendly and approachable. I called the minister's electorate and reported that the minister had obviously been hacked due to suspicious activity observed. I mean, when does a minister ever listen and engage and try to be helpful? As a woman, a single mother, and someone with a disability, it is something rare indeed to feel like you are being taken seriously. Make government friendly and inclusive. They are there to work, not promote their party. Everyone should be able to be treated fairly and have representation before any minister and with equal status, whether you're a great big conglomerate or an individual. Beyond all of the suggestions that I've made here, be clear, be concise. Don't change stuff every 5 minutes, sending people into panic attacks. Be inclusive. Be inclusive yourselves and bring participants and providers and government together as a working team. Be compassionate. Be authentic. Given the general apathy amongst our younger generation, the robo-debt and the other royal commissions actually show that the data you receive gets used. The amount of times I send stuff into the apathetic ether only to receive a diatribe of word salad months later. I think it's time across the world for governments to change the way that they have done business. The first place to look is within government, to make sure that people feel fulfilled and trained properly. Competence will enable a great deal of trust. Make sure there is a clear pathway for participants from onboarding to end of life. For such great ventures to be successful, it is important that everyone is on board, and it is clear to me that that was not the case. There is much to be said about keeping it simple. My mind wanders back to a society 500,000 years ago that saw fit to nurture, love and cherish a severely disabled man because he was part of the group, of the community. I think this is what is missing the most, is that value in each and every soul. From being called burdens of society to welfare bludgers, the loudest argument needs to be the value that every person brings to our community and not the cost. If a person feels valued, then it is feasible to trust that you have their best interests at heart. From the participant to their family, support workers, providers, government staff, if we value people and how they are treated, then we can trust. For people with disabilities who have been at the mercy of others for millennia, that must be reflected in society. And this failing is not just the failing of the NDIS, it's the failing of all of us. Had society been ready for the societal model of care, this journey would have been a lot easier. But it caused significant distress trying to get that square peg into the round hole. And despite all of the other things that need correcting, we must not fail to look at the bigger picture and do what we can to remedy that for a society that is kinder and more inclusive for all, benefits all of us. In reality, there are more of us square pegs out there than society cares to admit. In fact, I happen to be a square peg myself. Thank you for listening, and if you enjoyed this, there's more at carersandadvocates.com.